The retirement party was my idea. 32 years with the same company, same building, same parking spot near the loading dock. I figured I'd earned the right to make a small fuss about it. Nothing extravagant. A Friday evening at the hall above the Legion on Carling Avenue, maybe 60 people. A decent spread from the Portuguese place my late wife used to love. I told my son-in-law, Theodore, about it in March, gave him 4 months' notice. He nodded, said it sounded great, asked if there'd be an open bar. That should have told me something. I'm not a man who talks about his feelings easily. I grew up in a house where you fixed what was broken and you didn't complain about the rest. My father worked 30 years at the mill in Salt Sweet. Marie and I never once heard him say he was tired. So when I tell you that the night of June 14th was one of the worst nights of my life, I need you to understand what that means coming from me. My daughter Vivienne had been married to Theodore for almost 3 years at that point. They'd met at a fundraiser for the hospital where she worked as a lab technician. He was charming the way certain men are charming. Wide smile, good eye contact, the kind of handshake that makes you feel like you're being assessed. I didn't dislike him right away. That came later, slowly, the way a smell does when you can't figure out where it's coming from. Vivienne was 31 when they married, old enough that I stayed out of it. I raised her alone after her mother passed. Vivienne was 14 then, and we pulled each other through it the way you do. She was a serious girl, careful with money, good at her job. I was proud of her in the way you're proud when someone survives something hard and comes out the other side, still themselves. Theodore was a consultant. I was never entirely clear on what he consulted about. When I asked, he gave me answers that sounded complete, but left me no more informed than before. He worked from home mostly, drove a leased Audi, wore shirts that probably cost more than my grocery budget. He was 36, no savings that I ever knew of, and he handled money the way someone handles it when they've never had to think about where it came from. In the first year after they married, they rented a decent place in Canada. I helped with the deposit. Vivienne asked, and I said yes without hesitation. That's what fathers do. 6 months later, their rent went up and they needed to move. I helped again. Another deposit, first and last. I didn't track the exact amount. I should have. By the second year, Theodore had been between contracts for almost 8 months. Vivienne's salary covered the basics, but not much else. I started transferring money every month, sometimes $800, sometimes $1,200, once nearly $2,000 when their car needed work. I didn't mind. I had a pension coming, some savings, a house that was paid off. Vivienne was my only child. The joint account was Theodore's suggestion. He brought it up at dinner one evening in February, the year before I retired. He framed it as convenience. It would just be easier, he said, for when you need to send money, less back and forth. Vivienne was quiet while he talked. I remember thinking she didn't look entirely comfortable, but I told myself I was reading into it. I agreed. We set it up the following week. My name, Vivienne's name, Theodore's name. I transferred in $3,000 as a starting buffer, told them it was for emergencies. I kept putting money in. They kept drawing it down. I told myself it was temporary. Theodore would land a new contract. They'd get on their feet. Parents help their kids. That's the whole point. I believed that for longer than I should have. The retirement party invitations went out in April. I handed Vivienne hers in person, a Saturday afternoon when she came by alone to drop off some tax documents I'd helped her with. Theodore was playing golf. She hugged me and said she wouldn't miss it for anything. June 14th came. I drove to the hall at 4 to help set up. My colleague Dwight brought the sound system in his truck. My neighbor Fern organized the table arrangements, which I would never have managed on my own. By 6:30, the room was full people from work, old friends, a few relatives from out of town. My brother drove down from Sudbury. His wife made a speech that embarrassed me in the best possible way. Vivienne and Theodore were not there. By 7, I was checking my phone. By 7:30, I had texted twice. By 8, I stepped outside into the parking lot and called her number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called Theodore. Sama. I went back inside and told people she'd been caught in traffic. I said it with a straight face. I've had a lot of practice keeping a straight face. They didn't show, not at 8, not at 9, not at closing. My brother found me at the end of the night stacking chairs, and he didn't say anything, just picked up the other end of a table and helped me carry it. That's the thing about people you've known your whole life. They understand when silence is the kindest response. I drove home alone at 11. Sat in my kitchen in the dark for a while. Made tea I didn't drink. Vivienne called the next morning at 10. She said she was sorry, that something had come up, that Theodore had a family emergency she couldn't explain yet. Her voice had a careful quality to it, practiced almost. I told her I understood. I said it because I didn't know what else to say, and because I needed time to think. I started thinking that afternoon. I went online and looked at the joint account. Theodore had made 3 withdrawals in the past 2 weeks. One for $420 at a restaurant I didn't recognize on the other side of the city. One for $600 at what turned out to be a golf resort in Prince Edward County. One for $815 at a jewelry store. I looked at those 3 numbers for a long time. Then I looked at the balance. It was $43. I closed the laptop and went for a walk. It was a Sunday, overcast, one of those June days that can't decide if it wants to be summer yet. I walked down to the canal and along the path where my wife and I used to walk when Vivienne was small. I thought about the jewelry store charge. I thought about the fact that Vivienne had not been wearing any new jewelry the last time I saw her. I thought about a lot of things on that walk. When I got home, I called my accountant, a steady, careful man named Gordon who has been doing my taxes for 20 years. I told him what I'd found. He didn't react with alarm, which is one of the things I value about him. He just said, "Do you want to protect yourself, or do you want to wait and see?" I said I wanted to protect myself. He walked me through what I needed to do. The next morning, I went to the bank. I spoke with a woman in a small glass office who looked about 30 and handled the situation with a professionalism I was grateful for. I explained that I wanted to remove my name from the joint account and that I wanted to understand what options I had. She asked a few questions. I answered them. She made some calls to a supervisor. In the end, because the account had 3 names and I was one of them, I could not unilaterally close it without the others, but I could remove my own access and stop all future transfers. I did that. I also transferred out the remaining $43, which felt slightly petty, but also felt correct. I went home and made lunch and didn't call Vivienne. She called me 4 days later. Theodore was with her. I could hear him in the background. She said they'd been thinking about the future, that they'd found a house in Barhaven they wanted to put an offer on, that they needed help with the down payment. She said it the way someone says something they've rehearsed smooth, a little too smooth. She said they were thinking around 40,000. I let a moment pass. I said, "Vivienne, I need to ask you something first." I heard her breathing change. I asked her about the golf resort in Prince Edward County. I asked about the jewelry store. I told her I'd seen the account. The line went quiet. Not the quiet of someone surprised, the quiet of someone caught. Theodore spoke up then. His voice was different from usual. Less warm, more clipped. He said the withdrawals were personal expenses that they'd intended to pay back, that I was misunderstanding the situation, that I had set up a joint account knowing that all 3 of us would use it. I said, "Theodore, I set up that account for emergencies." He said, "Financial stress is an emergency." That was the moment something shifted in me. Not anger, exactly. Clarity, more like it. The kind of clarity that's been building for a long time under the surface and finally comes through. I said I needed to think. I hung up. I called my brother that evening. He listened. He is a man of few words, but when he speaks, they tend to be the right ones. He said, "You already know what you're going to do. You're just giving yourself time to be sure." He was right about that. I spent the next week being sure. I reviewed every transfer I'd made to Vivienne and Theodore over the past 3 years. I went through my records, bank statements, texts, where I'd confirmed amounts. The total was not a number I'm going to write down here, but it was significant. More than I had let myself calculate before, because I hadn't wanted to see it. I wrote it down on a piece of paper and looked at it for one evening, and then I put the paper in my desk drawer. I called a lawyer not for anything dramatic, just to understand where I stood. She was calm, practical, told me what I already suspected. What had happened likely didn't rise to the criminal threshold of fraud, but it was a clear breach of trust, and I had every right to restructure my finances however I chose. She also mentioned, gently, that joint accounts with in-laws are almost always a poor idea in hindsight. I thanked her for not saying that sooner would have been more helpful. I rewrote my will that same week. I had been meaning to update it since my retirement anyway. My previous will left everything to Vivienne, which had always seemed obvious. The new one is more considered. My house goes to a land trust for affordable housing. My RRSP and pension assets are split between two charities. My wife cared about one for pediatric research, one for a food bank in our old neighborhood. There is a small amount for Vivienne, conditional and specific. I left detailed instructions for my executor, who is my brother, and who took on the responsibility with the seriousness it deserved. It was not a decision made in anger. That's the part I want to be clear about. Anger would have been faster and louder. This was quieter. This was me sitting at my kitchen table over several evenings, thinking about what my wife would have said, thinking about what I actually valued, thinking about the difference between what I owed my daughter as her father and what she had a right to expect as an adult woman who had made her own choices. In the end, I decided that I had been a very good father for a very long time, and that I did not owe anyone the rest of my retirement. They came to the house on a Sunday in late August. I knew they were coming. Vivienne had texted the day before asking if they could stop by, phrasing it carefully, not mentioning money. I said yes. I made coffee. I did not make food, which was itself a kind of answer. They sat in my living room, the same living room where Vivienne grew up, where her mother and I used to sit on Sunday evenings reading while she did homework at the coffee table. Theodore sat forward on the couch in the posture of a man preparing to negotiate. Vivienne sat beside him and looked at the window rather than at me. Theodore opened. He said they'd had time to reflect and they recognized that there had been miscommunications. He said the situation with the account was more complicated than it looked. He said they still needed help with the house, that the market wasn't going to wait, that this was actually a good investment opportunity for me if I thought about it that way. I let him finish. I said, Theodore, I closed the account. I've updated my will. I won't be providing any further financial support. He started to respond, and I held up one hand. I said, I'm not asking for an argument. I'm telling you a decision I've made. Vivienne looked at me then. She had started to cry a little, quiet, controlled. She said, Dad, we're struggling. She said it the way she used to say things to me when she was small and needed something to be fixed. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, I know. That's not something I caused. Theodore stood up. He used the word unfair twice. He said I was punishing Vivienne for his mistakes, which I thought was an interesting thing to admit in the way he meant it as a defense. He said I had set up an account with his name on it, and I couldn't be surprised that he'd used it. I stood up too. I said, I think it's time for you both to go. Vivienne said my name. Just my name. Once, the way she did when she was a teenager and I'd made a decision she didn't like. I said, I love you. That isn't what's in question. What's in question is what I'm able to do and what I'm willing to do, and those things have changed. They left. Theodore didn't shake my hand on the way out. Vivienne stopped at the door and turned back, and for a moment I thought she might say something that would matter. But she just nodded and followed him down the porch steps. I stood in the doorway and watched the Audi back out of my driveway. The neighbor's kid was riding his bike in slow circles on the sidewalk. A normal Sunday afternoon. I went back inside and poured the coffee down the sink because it had gone cold. That was 8 months ago. My retirement has been, on the whole, good. I took a trip to Newfoundland in September, something I'd been saying I'd do for years. I stayed a week in a small town on the Bonavista Peninsula and walked along the coast every morning and felt, genuinely, like myself, in a way I hadn't in quite some time. I came home, sunburned, and rested. I see Dwight most Thursdays for coffee. Fern and I have started a garden in the backyard. Nothing ambitious, tomatoes and beans, and one very optimistic attempt at corn. I've been volunteering 2 mornings a week at the food bank, one of the charities in the will, and it seemed right to show up in person before leaving them money. Vivienne and I have spoken twice since August. Both times were brief, careful, not quite comfortable. I don't know what will happen with us over time. I hope something. I think the conditions for it are that she has to find her own way for a while. Actually find it, not just talk about it while waiting for me to solve it. That's not a punishment. It's just the thing I wasn't able to give her by continuing to help. Theodore, I haven't spoken to. A colleague asked me at coffee last month whether I had any regrets. He meant about retiring, I think, but I answered the other question anyway. I said I regretted not seeing it sooner. I regretted the joint account. I regretted, maybe, that I had made it so easy for so long that making it stop felt to Vivienne like abandonment rather than what it actually was, which was the end of something that should have ended years before. But sitting at that kitchen table in the dark, the night of my retirement party, staring at the $43 balance in that account, I had the strange, disorienting feeling of something becoming very simple. All the explaining I'd been doing to myself, all the reasons and the context and the benefit of the doubt, just falling away. What was left was simple. I had worked 32 years. I had raised a daughter alone. I had built something careful and steady out of not very much to begin with. And I had decided, sitting in my kitchen at 11 o'clock on a June night with cold tea in front of me, that the rest of it was mine. I've thought a lot about what I would have done differently. Not in a way that punishes me, I'm past that, but in the honest way you go back over a road you've driven and notice where the signs were that you missed. The joint account was the clearest one. Theodore suggested it, and I said yes, inside of a week. I told myself it was practical. What it actually was, I think, is that I wanted to believe the version of things he was describing, a family that operated with trust and ease, where money moved around without friction because everyone had good intentions. That's a pleasant thing to believe. I was willing to pay for it. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell stories like this one. It's not that you're naive, exactly. It's that you want something to be true, and wanting it badly enough makes you stop asking the questions that might threaten it. I wanted Vivienne to be happy. I wanted Theodore to be the kind of man I could respect. I wanted the version of the future where I retired comfortably, and my daughter had built something solid, and we all had Sunday dinners without tension. I kept funding that version long after the evidence had stopped supporting it. What I've come to think is this. The choices we make over years accumulate into a kind of structure, and eventually that structure either holds you up or it doesn't. Theodore didn't build the conditions that made what he did possible on his own. I helped. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but I helped. Every transfer that came without a real conversation, every time I smoothed something over because I didn't want to create conflict, every time I chose the comfortable version of events over the accurate one. Those were my choices. They had consequences I eventually had to live with. The evening I sat at my kitchen table and looked at that $43 balance, I wasn't just looking at what Theodore had taken. I was looking at what I had allowed to be built over 3 years, piece by piece, with my own hands and my own money and my own reluctance to see clearly. That's the hard part of personal accountability. It doesn't only apply to people who do wrong things on purpose. It applies to the ones who look away. I had looked away for a long time. What I found on the other side of that, the lawyer's office, the updated will, the morning I stood in my doorway and watched the Audi back out for the last time, wasn't relief exactly. It was more like solidity. The feeling of standing on something real after a long time of standing on something I'd built out of optimism and money and not enough honesty. Vivienne and I are not close right now. That's a real loss. I don't minimize it. But I think the version of closeness we had before was also partly constructed, built on me managing things so she never had to confront what her marriage actually required of her. That wasn't love. That was me being afraid of what would happen if I stopped. Real steadiness, I've learned, isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do with the clarity once it arrives, whether you act on it or talk yourself out of it one more time. I acted on it. That's the only part I don't regret.